Okay, we might kick off then. Welcome back, everybody. So this is going to be a bit of a joint question session for the last two sessions. So we'll run just a little bit over time. We'll probably spend 15 minutes on this one, I think. There's a bazillion questions here, which I'm probably going to get lost in, but we'll give it a crack. First question from Kath to Dave. Says, thank goodness, Dave, that you've shown stoat trapping increases the stoats. We've been finding that all those many sites in Kahurangi National Park where stoat trapping has occurred without rat trapping, that predation by rats on Paulophanta land snails has started at high altitude areas. In a similar site at high altitude without stoat trapping, there's still no rat predation. Birds may be benefiting, but not others. Okay, so it's more of a comment, eh? The only thing to add to that, Dave?
No, presumably, locally you could find out the altitude at which you sort of stop seeing rats, and really you'd have that, and that might change over time, but you'd have that sort of key band where this effect might be important, and you need to know what your species are and are there any, in that area. And maybe, I mean, this is just off the top of my head actually, but rat control is very hard to do over big areas, but maybe something like this, if you're putting in stoat control, maybe the key would be to just do rat control above where the rats are at the moment and try and pick them up as they move in or something. But I think we definitely need to be thinking about how we manage that kind of thing affordably.
Thank you. Question for you, Joe. Did your tracking tunnels results mirror the density estimate? It's from Josh.
Thanks for that question, Josh. No, they didn't. Well, they did to some extent, but they saturated. So when we started doing tracking tunnels in late winter of the last year, they were essentially already at 100% across the site, and they remained at almost 100% right up until winter of 2020, even though we knew from our density estimation that the rats had well crashed, probably 5 months before then. So it was very interesting, and it probably is related to those rats just get so hungry, so you get a better detection probability in your tracking cards, and that's some more modelling that we're working on with Dean as well, to understand those relationships between density, tracking cards, and snap trapping as well.
Well, just another call out to you, Dean Anderson. If you could come onto the panel, would be quite helpful, please. Another question for you, Joe. Jamie writes, thanks, Joe, really interesting. Looking back to your original data points in August 19, which of the 3 potential explanations do you think best explain those low, medium, and high results at the start, mid-mast?
So my 3 explanations were winter temperatures, food limitation, and stoats. And we're talking about the high densities that we saw at the beginning of the mast cycle. So, but there were really low densities at high elevation. So I think mainly, we're talking just about a food story. There's this increased resource in the system, and there's already a population of rats at low and mid elevation that can immediately respond and increase. Whereas I think at high elevation, like Dean said, because there are either no rats or very, very few rats, when we get that pulsed resource, it's just all really lagged. So I think it's a bit of a joint story between food, abundance. Yeah, I think it's mainly a food story really at that stage of the mast cycle.
Okay, thank you. Okay, question for you, Susan. Roger writes, how important is habitat quality in determining rat recovery after aerial operations?
The answer is, Roger, I don't know, but given that it depends, I guess, what we mean by quality, but it looks as if richer habitats are favoured by rats. So I think the more food you get back into the system, the more you're going to have rats soaking it up. And so this is the thing. I mean, this is the conundrum. When we make forests better, we also make them better habitats for rats. So it's like this ratchet game. And so I think you can expect that correlation, and that's why we either pack up and go home or we get better at dealing with them.
Thank you. Another one for you, Susan. Do we understand the biomass response of non-bird ship rat prey? Is the bounce necessarily more impactful upon birds, or just more rats eating same share of general biomass?
That would be fascinating to know. So no, we don't. And that sort of speaks to something we will probably talk about a lot tomorrow, is just how difficult it is to actually gather data on bird outcomes and how they're faring through these cycles. And of course, that's the big challenge. But even as Adrian showed, invertebrate data, really hard to collect. And so, yeah, we just don't know enough really to answer that. I think a comment that someone made in John Innes the other day was that rat tracking rates work pretty well for density impact functions. So the more rats are tracking through tunnels, possibly the more harm they're doing. We may not want to get too hung up about exactly what the population's doing. That's a thought. I don't think we've got any data for that either, and that's a really interesting question.
It does, if I could just comment, that reminds me of work that Kim King did on stoats, which sort of a lot of people forget and have to be reminded of, I think, which is that if you ask the general public or sort of, general biologists about what happens through a mast event, as they say the stoats go up, and then when they run out of rats and they start eating birds. But actually Kim showed that actually stoats just kill and eat birds anytime they come across them. And so the risk is essentially a function of stoat density. And so, you could generate a hypothesis that rats, it's the same, that just the more rats you've got, the more of everything gets eaten. And they're not selective, they're just moving around and bumping into more things.
Thanks, Dave. Another question to you, Susan, from Christine. Says the timing of bounce back is highly variable. If you look at examples of sites, bounce back often happens when the next mast occurs. This is no doubt a stronger relationship at colder temperatures. Why did you not include mast in the models?
There may be that variation, Christine. We didn't see it in our models, and I think the way we've modeled time, you would find that mast is in there anyway, because we took year and month literally, and so in a big year, that mast would have been predicted in the model, and so I'm not sure that it is so variable. It may be that what we saw was that 2 to 3 year to the peak, and because of the timing of our masts through the last 20 years or so, those things are coinciding. So it may be coincidence rather than it hanging, it waiting. But then you also may be talking about a cold system, which a truly cold system, when that eruption happens quite a bit later than it does in a warmer system. And maybe there's been less food in the system between. So I think it'll depend where you are. I hope that's answered your question. I look forward to talking to you a bit more about this.
Okay, question for you, Dean, from Christine. How do you reconcile your results that immigration is necessary to explain growth rates with Joe's finding that her radio-collared rats didn't move much more than 100 meters?
In our model, the immigration was really constrained from the median or the mid elevation population up to the high elevation population. So as those individuals were moving from mid to high, whereas Joe's telemetry data was collected, I think I got this right, Joe, your telemetry data was only at the high elevation sites. So we weren't modeling the immigration or movement of high altitude individuals.
Cool. And another question, which is addressed to Dave, but I think it relates to yours, Dean. Was the migration of pregnant females considered in the model, which would give a greater flush of individuals in a short time? Perhaps Joe can comment on that too with the data.
Yep, absolutely. But I can't comment on that.
We we snap trapped individuals, obviously, so we can look at the demography of that first flush of individuals that we see at high elevation. A lot of them were older females, surprisingly. Some were pregnant, some weren't, but it wasn't a particularly, I wouldn't say it was a whole flush of pregnant females. Yeah.
Okay, James, why were the least cost pathways encircling your treatment area? Were these roads or rivers?
They were encircling the treatment area because there was an elevation penalty, and the treatment boundary happened to coincide with an increase in elevation. So they're following the valley floors around the outside of that particular treatment.
Well, thank you, James. Okay, and a bunch for you, Josh. Josh, you don't have any seasonal variables in your model. As we do more and more operations, especially in mast years, and they can't all be optimally timed, do the outcomes of spring, summer, winter operations differ?
I think the question says especially in mast years and can't all be optimally timed. So I suppose I think if you were baiting in a mast year, which essentially is a growth period, I can't tell whether there's a difference in the effect of that growth phase between those seasons within the growth phase. And I suspect that's completely overwhelmed by the fact that there's a lot of food in there all through all of those seasons. So, you know, really the kind of the divisions between those seasons are kind of arbitrary, and there's a lot of operations that, you know, I wouldn't be certain where to put them in which season. So I suspect that what that growth is, or food availability is the primary thing, and that there'll be some winters where there are lots of food and some winters where there aren't, and that's probably the most important thing rather than the actual season itself, although the season may be influencing how much food there is, if that gets at that.
Okay, thanks. So Colin writes, is there any indication that you could control rats before they start increasing?
Yes, definitely. Yep. So there's a little bit of work to do around this, but there's certainly plenty of operations that were done. You know, if we think of three, assuming you're talking about a kind of eruptive systems, Colin, if we think of like mast years, post-mast periods, and then like intermast or pre-mast, and there's certainly a lot of operations that are done during those pre-mast or intermast periods when rats are not skyrocketing and nor are they crashing, and they are part of that portion of operations that work really well in a non-growth phase. If we were getting into a game where we were, say, predicting a mast on the basis of a climate forecast, a delta T for the previous 2 summers, for example, and thinking that, okay, we've got enough rats in this system where we want to nip it in the bud, so we want to control before the growth starts, then I think at the moment when exactly that growth starts is something that we could do more work on. But you know, if you to be on the safe side, if you manage to implement that operation, you know, before flowering of beech trees started, which means sort of doing it before October, or even into the first month or few weeks of the flowering, that you're probably on the safe side there. I think some of the early work showed that rats actually do start breeding on the pollen or the energy that the flowering starts to introduce before the seed actually arrives. So I think, you know, getting in before that starts to happen is probably you know, the timing that we're thinking about. But yes, there's definitely indications that you can achieve high kills in those contexts.
Thanks.
I don't know
Bruce,
if we can get any comment from Graham or Elliot about that, because I have a feeling he's done stuff where he looks at the earlier you do it, the trouble is that the longer post-op, the rats have to increase again. And so I think there's an optimum period before. If you do it too early, you do knock the rats down, but then they've got time to come back up again. But
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so I guess the history, the whole reason why we've got into this habit of baiting in the middle of the growth phase is from that kind of trying to minimize the area under the curve. But they all assume, the assumption with that is that all of your operations are going to achieve the same high % kill. And so those models don't allow for an average kill in the middle of, if you're baiting in the middle of a growth phase. So yes, I think at the moment we have forests. Sometimes some forests will go into a mast year starting from very low densities, 0 to 5% on the tracking tunnel scale, and those sites will at maximum growth rates they'll reach about 60% tracking tunnel rates by germination time in about October, November. And at that point they haven't done much damage, and you can control them after the germination's happened. If you go into a mast year with a kind of primed to pre-primed, or you're at a lower elevation and you're going into the mast year with 15, 20, 30% rat tracking, those rats will do a lot of damage before germination happens. And so in those cases, I think I think in those cases, one pulse of control is just simply a pipe dream that's going to get your rat sensitive species, depending on which ones you're talking about, through that rat plague. And you're going to have to do 2 pulses of control. And if you've got no option but to do aerial operations, or even if you have other options, one of those pulses of control needs to happen before the flowering food input starts. And then the other one has to happen after the seed has germinated, if as you suggested, your first operation hasn't got you right through the whole 18-month eruption period.
Lovely, thank you, Josh. Okay, I think we might just leave it there. Thanks everybody for the last 2 sessions and our panelists answering all those questions. I'll just remind people that there are some questions there that we haven't answered yet, but we will endeavour to answer all of them via email or some other means after the webinar series. So just a reminder that tomorrow's session starts at 9 o'clock, and so tomorrow is mostly, there's 2 sessions that are focused on bird outcomes, a session that's focused on what the forest managers want and need from research, and then finally a session on applying research to management. And this session will be a bit more open. We'll be doing that through Teams, I think. So we'll give people a lot more kind of ability to have input just through talking. And in there we'll kind of talk a little bit about the broad scale model that Dean has been developing. And also we'll talk through some ideas for case studies. So we're actively soliciting ideas for case studies from you. And the idea of these is that they're an opportunity for both us to learn from the application of knowledge from the program, and also to achieve some benefit through working with you and a chance for you to work with some of our researchers. We're planning on these, so this is largely about large scale management. By large scale, I don't necessarily mean thousands of hectares, but not sort of postage stamp applications either. It may be to do with rat control or pest control, maybe to do with bird outcomes, or a combination of the both. We're kind of very open about what that's going to look like. And so at the moment, what we're doing is soliciting ideas, and then we'll follow up a lot of those after our discussions tomorrow. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and thanks heaps to all of our presenters today for giving us what was, well, to me anyway, was a very entertaining day of talks, and yeah, some really good questions. So we'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.